welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. In today's edition, we're going to be talking about last week's budget, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. And to help us unpick it, we've got Steve Hall, who is an academic and a political commentator and author. And one of the books which I would highly recommend, which we've reviewed on Resistance TV last year, a few months back now, is called The Death of the Left. And in that book, amongst other things, Steve Hall and Simon Winlow, the authors of it, talk about how the left has missed a trick on economic policy. Anyway, we're going to get into that today in terms of the budget, what was said, what was proposed, and how the official opposition have responded to it and whether they've got anything better in their locker than what the government is proposing. So let's get Steve on the screen. How are you, Steve?
Yeah, morning. Yes, I'm fine, Chris. How are you?
Good. I'm not too bad at all, mate. Not too bad at all.
Good.
As you'll probably heard or realised now from Steve's salutation there, we're actually pre-recording this, even though this is going to be going out in the evening. We're recording it in the morning. So, Steve, just give us your thoughts then on the budget, just in broad brush terms. I mean, what did you make of it?
Well, it's the usual non-event. What has always intrigued me is the why they call it a budget in the first place. The budget is an analogy to a household bringing money in. Someone goes out, earns money, brings it in, and you sit there. And my mum used to call it reckoning up.
Yeah,
she used to sit there, do a reckoning up, and the fish and the vegetables and the mortgage and the rent and whatever, and then see how much you got left to for ice creams and a trip to Whitley Bay and back, Yes. And that was the household budget. But the difference between a household and a state is that we didn't have a printing press in the shed in the garden to print out whole family pounds. I mean,
if you did, Steve, you would get prosecuted, mate.
Yeah, I'm sure they could find other things to arrest me for as well, in this political climate. But that would be one of them that would be easier to stick on me.
Yeah.
Now, before the 1840s, I think that was 1844. Don't quote me on the exact year. I've got a memory like a sieve sometimes. But private banks could create their own currencies, and they could, use it as medium of exchange, unit of account, and to some extent a store of value as well. After that act was passed, of course, the state is the sovereign issuer because nobody else can do it. So the state's a currency issuer, we are currency users. So why do we call it a budget?
Yeah,
it's not a budget at all.
Well, we'll get into that, Steve, in a minute. I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts, though, in terms of some of the propositions that have been put forward by the Chancellor Hunt, for example, the 2p cut in national insurance payments. Well, what do you make of that? Do you think, is that an election winner? Is it going to make a difference to working class families or not?
Well, it's just one of these little palliatives. What the budget, the inverted commas, is simply an adjustment of the social group's various contributions to inland revenue, to taxation. That's virtually all the bill. There's other stuff as well that we can discuss, but that's what the politicians put out, and what the media put out on behalf of the politicians, are slight adjustments to what people pay. And of course, governments these days, as George Galloway has said, slightly impolitely, but rather accurately, I think, are being two cheeks of the same backside.
Yeah.
It's not the word we usually use, but we know what it means. It is that they've got to try to be a government for all seasons. So they're trying to, to appease and attract and mollify as many social groups as they possibly can. NI 2p off that. Well, how much will that save the average household in America? A couple £100 a year, I don't know. So some people might be pleased with that. It's a little saving. I suspect and I've heard whispers from Westminster that they're trying to they might phase out NI.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been on the cards for a little while, though, I think, hasn't it?
I think so, yeah. And because it costs more to administer, why not just have one set of administration for, one single tax? So they might try to do that in order to save themselves some time, effort, and money, sack a few civil servants or whatever, which doesn't really help anyone. So again, it's a palliative, a couple £100 a year. Which social groups will that appeal to? Well, it will appeal to anyone on sort of middle to low incomes, really. So, that's a little palliative, but that's all it is. It's again a bit of a non-event.
Were there any other highlights in the budget that caught your attention, Steve? Because it seems to me to be pretty much of a non-event, really, in many ways. I mean, there was the 2p off the national insurance, which was a bit of a headline grabber, notwithstanding the fact that it's not going to make that much of a difference to people's income at the end of the day, because there's going to be no increase in the income tax threshold, is there?
No, and we're still looking at inflation at sort of 4%. They're projecting that to come down to 2% in 2024, probably by continuing the austerity measures of keeping interest rates relatively high, which of course affects businesses and mortgage borrowers, and really punishes people. It's an ineffective way of doing it, but of course it saves the money hoarders and the money lenders. Their income streams remain higher, so that's to protect basic finance, the financial industry over the population at large. So if we get inflation down to 2%, it might mean something, but it's certainly not going to help anyone keep up with inflation, even down to 2%. It's just sort of keeping. I don't know. I haven't done the calculations, but it's somewhere, in the region of inflation. So really, it's going to make no difference. Other sweeteners like child benefit threshold raised to £80,000. Again, a sweetener for people on middle to low incomes who have children. That will that affect many people? Raising it from 60 to not many people in that bracket, in that £20,000 bracket. You're only talking about a small percentage of the population who are in that bracket. So again, a bit of a non-event. The non-dom tax is a vote winner, isn't it? After Sunak's Mrs. I can't remember her name, was discovered, paying no tax because of her non-dom status. So again, that's a sort of a bit of hyperbole. It doesn't affect an awful lot of people. We won't be earning a lot of revenue by doing that. But it's just they're sort of little signifiers of social justice. They're little signs that, the government cares about these injustices. The government's willing to regulate on behalf of the population and ensure fairness. But they really are palliatives. Property tax down 4% to 24%. Who will that affect? Well, people with wealthy property.
Yeah,
we'll gain more from that. So that's not an overall gain for the working classes or the middle income. So, in
your opinion, Steve, who do you think is going to benefit most then from this budget? I mean, is it going to be, notwithstanding the fact that you're saying it's not a lot, that will be gained by the 2p reduction in national insurance contributions, for example, but is it working class people or middle class people or the elites, financial elites in society? Who's going to benefit most, or is nobody going to benefit very much from it at all?
Well, nobody really. It all depends on inflation and growth, because they're all based on growth projections and inflation. Can we grow without causing inflation? If we keep high interest rates, and if we allow the system to carry on as it is, it's doubtful that we can have that growth without inflation. I mean,
let's come on to growth in a minute as well, Steve. Just tell me what your thoughts are about the official opposition, the Labour Party opposition, Rachel Reeves and Sir Keir Starmer's response to the budget. What did you make of that?
Well, I didn't listen to all of it, but what I got were a few sort of barbed critiques of details, but not a critique of the overall direction of the economy. They were criticising the budget in a similar way as we could, that it does more for the wealthier sections of society than it does for poorer ones and the middle income ones. They're right about that, of course, but that's what the Labour Party always says. And it's usually always right about that, But it's the degree. It just isn't really not going to really make a lot of difference, depending on inflation and depending on growth. So they're expecting growth to move up to 2% by 2028. How are they going to do that? Well, what is Reeves promising to do? Now, it's more important than the budget, is what Reeves is the method Reeves is using to try to ensure growth, which is to attract private investment.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things I heard Sir Keir Starmer talking about in an interview, which I'm assuming was after the budget, but I'm not absolutely sure. But he was talking about a reliance on private sector investment to grow the economy. What do you make of that as a proposition?
Well, let's look at it historically. Let's take a broader view. And I think that's the problem, is that our politicians and the media have a sort of live for the day attitude of a presentism, as the philosophers call it, that they look at the what's happening on the day and then the immediate future. Let's look at it historically. Have the private investors done us proud? Since 1960. 1945, Labour government, probably the best government we ever have. I hope it's not the best government we ever will have, but it was the best government we ever had. It was a sort of fairly mild social democratic platform. It was about nationalisation. 243% of GDP in public investment. It was a huge figure, and we all know that it's not about debt. We can talk about that later if you want.
Yes,
it was a huge figure. Nationalisation of major industries, rail, etc. Education system, NHS, we know the whole story. And during that period, the British economy grew very rapidly, dragged us out of post-war austerity. It wasn't all about the Marshall Aid Plan, because we spent most of that on welfare. It was about public investment in industry, which attracted private investment in ancillary industry. So, you'd have something like a huge steelworks in concert, but you also have British Oxygen and all of the haulage contract also. So it generates wealth-creating centres, production centres. Yeah. And also huge services, people running cafes. I mean, my little hometown concert next to steelworks, we had 3 wonderful Italian cafes there. I mean, like really, with you remember those beautiful old machines with making the coffee and the little booths?
Oh, yeah, I do, absolutely, yeah.
Because it was wealth. There was some wealth being generated. Now, we did well up until 1960. After 1960, because more investment was needed, we were working with very old-fashioned, antiquated plant and machinery. And we don't forget, we're the oldest industrial nation in the world. And some of the infrastructure we're using was like sort of 200 years old, some of it,
Yeah.
And or at least 150. They stopped investing. And they found other investments. Then we have this globalist phenomenon. The capitalist economy has always been globalist to some extent. It's on the British and Habsburg Empire models. They've always been globalist. But so they started looking to places like Japan and Indonesia and China, and latterly China after Deng Xiaoping's reforms in 1978 or 79, I think that was, late 70s. They started looking for investment opportunities abroad that were making much higher returns. Investors are interested in returns, nothing else really, in higher returns. So old Blighty was simply sank down lower on their list for private investment. When BMW took over the Austin Rover, which is the old British Leyland plant, they came and they said, "Oh, we've inherited a museum." Yeah. And in a sense, they were right. Because even Derek Robinson, who was the bête noire of the Liberals in the 1970s, he was right when he's saying there's been no investment in this place for decades.
He said that we needed, if we're going to compete, Derek Robinson, with the volume car manufacturers in Europe and so on, there needs to be a massive invement program.
Absolutely.
And he got something for his troubles.
Go on. I was working in Steelworks in 1975. And we had machinery that was still there in the 1948 stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's the story of British manufacturing.
So, no, private investment is very unreliable. How is Reeves going to attract private investment? There's only one real big arrow she has in her quiver, and that's by lowering taxes, corporate taxes, and taxes for big business. I don't see it happening. We're making a transition from into what some people are calling the fourth industrial revolution. It's supposed to be a green revolution on renewables, electric vehicles, and all the sort. Are we really getting onto are private investors thrusting us onto the cutting edge of this? Once we're the world's premier industrial nation? I don't think so. An awful lot of stuff still made abroad.
I mean, one of the other things that, and you indeed have talked about this focus on growth, but gross domestic product is a very kind of blunt instrument, isn't it, to measure economic success, because we've often mentioned on this program.
Yes,
there's 14.5 million people living in poverty in this country, even though we're the sixth biggest economy in the world. So what do you make of this focus on growth? Both the Tories and Labour are talking about, growth is going to be the salvation, but is it really?
No, because we've been relying for too long on asset inflation, especially of housing, because that's sort of now counted as a sort of growth in GDP figures, and also growth of financial services, which the financial services that set up the derivatives markets, the collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, basically turning debt into a tradable commodity, trading in people's debts. Yeah. Irresponsible lending, which caused the subprime housing crisis, which led to the financial crash of 2008, and also selling insurance policies, because the other thing's risky. They're starting selling all these complex insurance policies to each other to try to minimize the risk. So that counts towards GDP. So is it the sort of growth that is going to create jobs, restore communities in the derelict places of the old industrial north and Wales and places in Scotland, Northern Ireland? No, that's not the sort of growth we're getting. We're getting growth very London-centric, growth in financial services, IT services, which aren't labour-intensive. And we're not getting the sort of growth that creates the sort of secure jobs that we need. The MMT people are suggesting a job guarantee program, which I'm sort of rather not hugely enthusiastic about it. But it could be the only way to bring some prosperity back to some of these regions and locales, is to have a government-funded guaranteed job. But I'm not sure that would be a vote winner with British workers and with British.
No. Well, I mean, just in terms of then, the budget, what should it have been? I mean, one of the things I think that Stephanie Kelton says that, the budget's a bit of a misnomer anyway, really, to refer to it as that, and we should use the budget sort of process, as it were, to create to service the economy, as it were, not the other way around, because, as I've said, we've ended up in a situation where we've got massive poverty in the country, precarious employment's endemic. These are the little things we talked about over and over again on Resistance TV. None of the mainstream parties seem to have a solution to address these problems. I mean, it's just basically more of the same.
Absolutely.
What's needed then, Steve, to create that good society? What should be, if you'd have been the Chancellor last week, what would you have been putting forward?
I would have been putting forward some of the policies that are outlined in the Workers' Party of Britain's 10-point programme and the manifesto. Now, let's just go with this budget analogy for a moment. Let's just pretend it is a budget, right? And we have so much money to spend. Now, when the politicians talk about this budget, they're always talking about inland revenue, about taxes, and as I said at the beginning, whether the taxation is fair, which social groups are contributing the most. What a lot of economists don't understand about the British people is the taxation. They complain and grumble about it, don't they? And it's taxing on this sort of stuff. I remember hearing one guy in a pub. This is a little joke, and he's saying, if the tax situation doesn't get any better, I'm going to deflect to the Soviet Union. Deflect. It was I got a great laugh, but they're always to the socialist, but they're always grumbling about taxation. But underneath that grumbling is a sense of civic pride that they're contributing and they're making decisions. I decide where my tax, I don't want to on these silly outreach programs and for drug addicts. But I wanted to go into, I wanted to go into the defense spending or whatever. So they pretend they're making decisions and they feel good about themselves because their wealth creation, their hard work is contributing to the country. A lot of economists, particularly the MMT and heterodox economists, don't get this because people don't hate taxes. It's a love-hate relationship they have with them, you see. So the government focuses on this because it tickles their civic pride. So it attracts people, that, well, is it fair? What am I contributing to here? Aren't I a good person? I'm giving my taxes. What isn't spoken about is the fact that taxes don't fund public spending. In actual fact, they're used to control inflation, to redistribute some money, and to alter behavior, like sin taxes on alcohol and tobacco. That's the function of tax. They don't. In fact, the government's sovereign currency issue pays for everything, either through public spending, public investment. Again, a lot of the heterodox economists don't make this distinction between spending and investment because technically it's all spending, and they're right. But again, people like this distinction between spending and investment because spending in their minds is seen as profligate, whereas investment is seen as building for the future. Do you see what I mean? So important distinction. We've got to keep that distinction. So public spending, but the rest of it is into the bank's reserve accounts at the central bank and lent out as interest-bearing loans. So are the banks doing their job? Did they, when QA, when I got all that helicopter money, it was nearly £1 trillion, wasn't it, after 2008 crisis, shoved into their reserve account? And the absolutely incredible thing is if we put the interest rates up, we pay them more interest on the money we've given them. So it's sitting in the reserve account, so they're getting more interest for it, Yeah. Did they lend that out? No, they didn't, because they were very cautious because they thought austerity would reduce aggregate demand. Well, of course it does. It reduces aggregate demand so credit worthiness was more and more difficult for business owners and workers to prove.
Right. So when they lend, Steve, they just create the money out of thin air. They don't have deposits anyway, do they?
No, they don't. Well, they keep the deposits for clearance, settlement, and interbank lending.
But the amount of deposits, if the loans were based upon the amount of money they've got in deposits, they wouldn't be able to make as many loans as they do. So they just create it. That
was the old fractional reserve theory, that they keep a bit, but they lend pounds on, that was the old gold standard, gold bullion.
It's interesting,
that's a myth as well. They actually, the state, the government, the treasury, and the central bank puts the money in their reserve because it trusts them to get that money back, and the interest payment they get is their business. Now, the banks didn't lend, so we can't trust the banks. We can't trust foreign direct investment. We don't want too much of foreign direct investment. We don't want American companies owning our industry.
It's a curious way to go on, though, isn't it, Steve? To sort of, as it were, put in this third party, in the hope that that the banks will sustain the economy, given that what we'd seen up until 2008, where there'd been this massive shift away from labor intensive industries, jobs being offshored, etc., and all the emphasis being on financial services, and then in the end they never let the money out in any event.
Well, they don't.
It's a curious way going on. Why don't governments, and maybe you want to just sort of talk about this because you was beginning to speak about this at the beginning, really. Why doesn't government just invest in the economy, and deal with the infrastructure crisis that we've got and the public services that are in meltdown and so on?
Well, I'll give you the straight answer to that. I won't waffle. I've been doing plenty of that in the last few minutes, but I won't waffle on this one. It's because the politicians are in the bankers' pockets.
Yeah.
And the bankers, it's their business. It compound interest on lending out sovereign currency to businesses and consumers is their business. Without that business, well, you see banks are closing their branches all over the place on the high street now. They're having to trim their business down. They're going online. I'd like to see some of the profits. I'd like to see some of the spreadsheets to see how much they're making and whether they're making more money by doing this. Sacking a lot of bank workers, of course, because bank workers are working class. They're out.
Of course.
And we should be looking after them, which we're not, of course. They're not lending because the myth is, the great capitalist myth. There's the entrepreneur, the Ayn Rand myth of in the Fountainhead. What was his name? John Galt. The character. We are the wealth creators. We are risk takers. We risk our money and put a huge effort in our great intellect. Well, I don't know about great intellect, but I'm sure. But we put we are the pioneers of progress. In fact, the banks and all of the huge asset management corporations, BlackRock, Vanguard, and the rest, all of these basic money lenders are risk averse. And they're always looking to go for the lowest risk for the highest return. So they want to privatize public utilities, health, education, all of the food, all of the basic stuff that people need every day, which carry the lowest risk. They're not risking their investments. And let's say, oh, well, we have to because we're looking after your pension funds. Well, pension funds are a very small part of it. They're actually leveraging in a lot of their money for their investments, which means borrowing cheap from commercial banks and lending out for much higher interest rates. So they're taking small risks by investing in economic activities that really, well, we're going to need energy forever. We're going to need electricity forever. There's not much risk in that. They might lose a bit if things are badly managed or whatever for a while, but then they'll get it back eventually. So it's all mirrors.
Yeah, right, indeed. I mean, the banks, like you say, risk averse, etc., and always after a quick buck. And it seems to me that, and I think the statistics bear this out, that that most of their activities is in real estate, is in properties, in mortgage, housing and all the rest, driving a property boom, not in investing in businesses. So for the government, and it's the Labour government that went in for this big, massive quantitative easing agenda initially, to as it were put the emphasis on the banks to keep the economy going. I mean, it didn't make any sense, did it?
Well, no, because it was supposed to give the banks their liquidity back. Now, with that liquidity, they were supposed to lend out, but they didn't. They did a bit here and there, a few daft ideas coming out, a few successful ideas here and there. But in terms of the big stuff we invested in after World War II to get the economy back on the track, they're still relying on private investment. They're even for the new nuclear program. If you look at, I know you're not very keen on nuclear, but for the new nuclear program, they're relying on private investment. Everything's private. And if they can't, the private investors aren't interested, there's nothing the government's going to do about it. We can't go on like this. That means that there's a democratic deficit at the core of our economy. Investment is the core of every economy, whether it's capitalist or socialist. Every economy requires credit and investment. It's an economic principle. We discovered it thousands of years ago that if you can give credit out, you don't have to wait until you make stuff and sell it to get the money back before you can invest in more. If you can give credit out, you can pay wages, buy materials before you've made anything. So you have to take risk, a calculated risk. But because you can do that, that speeds up the growth of large. They learned this in Mesopotamia 4,500 years ago. They started giving out tally sticks and what have you. Right at the center, the end of the Silk Road, the center of the commercial production center, and the Third Eye Crescent.
So when Gordon Brown then, with that slip of the tongue, if you remember, during at the height of the financial crash, when he said he'd save the world, I mean, he really saved the banks, hadn't he, rather than the world? Banks.
He said banks, don't forget QE just goes into the bank's accounts at the central banks. It's non-inflationary because it's not being spent. It's not spent until they start lending it out. And like I said, they did in dribs and drabs. Let's not exaggerate. They lent bits of it out here and there. But so, people some entrepreneurs have good ideas. A lot of the entrepreneurship was in IT, that end of things, and of course we need that, but we also need to get back to some. We can't have a manufacturing fetish. There's no way that we're going to go back to producing everything that's now produced in places like China and Indonesia. We can't do that. We can't compete with that. But we should be looking at high-tech, high-quality investment like the Germans did in the 1960s, high-quality products. We already make some of them, and we should start making these again. This is a national security issue also. Well, we couldn't even make our own medical equipment during the pandemic.
Steve, you were saying there's no future for the sort of going back to the old kind of manufacturing days, and that may be true because that
Not
ship
to the
has-
extent that we had.
No,
We can
that's it.
return essentials.
No,
Essentials.
indeed. But there are other options, are there? Other things which are
Yes.
labour intensive. I mean, there's a massive housing crisis. There's a massive infrastructure crisis, isn't there? There's lots. I mean, if we're going to go down the kind of green
Absolutely.
revolution, there are
Construction.
when we're talking about growth, surely what we should be talking about is growth that benefits working class people, not just growth for the sake of it, as it were.
Absolutely.
Because we've got 14.5 million people in poverty, in what is the sixth biggest economy in the world. So
Loads of
going
stuff.
wrong in it.
We have loads of stuff that needs doing in construction, infrastructure, civil engineering, the return of some essential manufacturing. We must be able to manufacture our own steel, aluminium. Yeah. We must bring back essentials. And don't forget, when you start the manufacturing, when you start construction, infrastructural work, people have money, aggregate demand, which can be met by supply. Supply doesn't have to be material things. It doesn't have to be widgets and material stuff. A supply of services, of health services, of child care services, of cafes and restaurants, and the whole hospitality industry relies on wealth creation. So you can find jobs in there. Those jobs tend to be a bit insecure, and we need to do something about that. But that's an entirely different matter, which a party like the Workers' Party would attend to. So there's an awful lot to do, but an awful lot. We need public investment. If that attracts private investment, it makes them play catch up. If we get public investment in big stuff, roads, rail, infrastructure, essential manufacturing, and we start to grow the economy, the real economy of real resources and real services, then the private sector looks upon this and says, whoa, there's something growing here. We better get in on the act, yeah? So they start to move in around the periphery and start to look for public-private partnerships, start to looking at funding cafes, IT centres, all sorts of stuff. I'm not against the private sector. I agree with you that we should encourage cooperatives in private sector, without a doubt. But I'm not against people setting up small businesses that provide services and are part of the supply chain to large areas. We can boost the economy by using public, without a doubt. We've done it before. We have to do it in a different context now that we're looking at the move into the fourth industrial revolution. But surely, for the world's oldest industrial economy, that's not beyond us, Chris.
Well, they keep talking, don't they, about the affordability. We can't afford to do these things. We've got to be very, very careful, because obviously they're wedded to this notion of tax and spend, and concern about, if the government starts investing or spending too much, it's going to cause an inflationary problem. But what about, maybe just say what about that, but also what about the banks, which are pretty much unregulated? I mean, and as we've already said, they can just lend money and not that, just create loans out of thin air. I mean, they don't have to have the money in their banks to actually. Nobody seems to be talking about that. At least not in the kind of political elites.
Well, there are two ways
to do it. To be addressed. Do we need to address that kind of bank reform? The positive money advocates, they're saying that should put an end to, because it's actually the economy in a bad way.
Banks have the choice of whether to invest or not. Now, they assess the creditworthiness of businesses and consumers. And if they think the risk is too high, then they won't lend.
They might put the money into housing.
Short-termism and safety are built into the bank credit system. That they're looking for short-term, surefire, low-risk businesses. Not all of the time. Sometimes they'll take a punt, and if something looks good, someone invents some sort of food variation, or some posh restaurant, or something like that. They think, this looks like a good business plan. We'll give it a go. And don't forget, but they tend to suffer because we operate a limited liability system, which you have since the mid-19th century. So the business don't have to pay it back. So they're always risk averse.
Yeah, I mean, again, that also drives them towards housing as well, because you've got assets.
So there are two ways of doing this. Either one, we pump public investment in and ensure that there's a sort of growth in the supply that will meet the growing demand and not cause inflation. And that's not going to be easy, but we can do that. We can do, if we have the right politicians with the right economic advisors who know exactly what they're doing. We could do that. or an and/or is that we actually push the banks into lending and to become partners with the state in growing the economy. Now, that's going to be very, very difficult. It would involve some sort of legislation that banks must lend out so much in a period of time, or in a region during a period of time. I can't see them going for that.
Well, didn't John McDonnell actually address this with
he did, yeah,
a national investment bank? Because I don't think we can basically trust the bank, so we create a public sector bank to actually deliver this agenda.
Well, what he was saying, the message is very similar to what I've just said, is that public investment through, I like the idea of these regional investment banks, by the way, and some sort of regional governance as well that John Prescott was pushing at the time. I quite like that idea, especially coming from the Northeast. And, we've suffered deindustrialization as badly as anyone else. That what we're saying here is that the banks won't lead. We need public investment to kick this off, to start the ball rolling and get the banks playing catch up and saying, oh, look, there are opportunities here. We've got some growth here. We can lend out. There are good business plans here. This place it needs cafes, it needs childcare, it needs all of the stuff that the bigger industries are, creating jobs, big construction, all the rest of it, house building, house repair. I mean, the state of the houses, and house refurbishment, paving, roads, you name it, rail. We should nationalize rail, of course. It's a no-brainer, that, and so the principle here is that the state must lead. That's what Mariana Mazzucato, who's a good economist, calls the entrepreneurial state. Now, this isn't full-blown socialism. The purists might be watching me and get horrified, oh God, he's that Steve Hall again. He's not a proper socialist. But Chris, we've got to take one step at a time. We've got to build a platform on which we can do stuff that works. And then as we were moving into the 70s, people started to believe in us. And that we can do stuff properly. We created quite a wonderful atmosphere in the 60s. You're probably like me, old enough to just about remember the brighter atmosphere, the more optimistic atmosphere.
Absolutely. It was an optimistic.
That was kiboshed by the oil price rises. We can get all conspiratorial about that and accuse the Americans of deliberately dropping the production quotas to force OPEC to put up those prices and refusing. An easy fix there would have been 10% subsidy on oil usage in industry, and that would have sorted out that stagflation issue. There were other problems because inflation had been rising slightly in the late 60s anyway, but there are other reasons for that. Because people were putting up prices, aggregate demand was going up. But, there's no natural relationship between supply and demand. It's all about decisions. If there's aggregate demand there, they don't have to put up prices. They make decisions to put up prices. We could have, remember Barbara Castle, suggest price controls, pricing in and think of policies. We could do that. There are lots of things we could do to steady the ship and have it growing and plowing through the ocean and reaching a much, much better destination than the one we're headed for.
Well, the one we're heading to. Okay, Steve, in conclusion then, give us let's imagine you're the Chancellor now, give us your three top proposals that you would have put forward then in the budget last week. What would they be if I had to put you on the spot?
There would be one proposal, and that would be to adjust taxes according to their function.
Right.
Which would be to control inflation.
So tax reform then? Tax reform.
And I would, I'm not saying I wouldn't do any of these things. I mean, I would have, people looking at which groups should pay what. Maybe it's done things a good idea. Raising the threshold 80,000. Not a bad idea. I'm not against this budget in terms. But it just misses the point. It's the function of tax is not for public spending. The function of tax is to control inflation, redistribute income, and to alter behavior. So what I would do is upend the whole thing, and I would reframe the budget as a means of regrowing the British economy along the lines we need to go to move into the fourth industrial revolution and make this country a better place to live in for ordinary people. And I would I wouldn't use the term budget. I would change the term. This is a growth. This is about the right type of growth, sustainable growth into the future. That's what we need to be talking about.
Would you have a book words into your mouth, a redefinition of growth, though?
Yes. I think we need to see growth in the real economy of goods and services, not the derivatives economy, not the financial services industry. What the financial services industry is doing at the moment is seeing opportunities to spread around this new economy and to the hedge funds and, the hedge funds spreading the risks. It's all about risk aversion. That's what hedge funds do for a living. The hedge funds and all the rest of them, like a sort of vampire squid, just looking to put its tentacles everywhere it possibly can. And what we need to say is the entrepreneurial state will lead these moves, and the finance industry, if you can, play catch up with us. And we really said go with our sovereign currency and with methods of controlling inflation and moving into a direction of sustainable growth. They would have to try hard to catch up. And the harder they try, the more they have to sweat, the more I'd like it.
Yeah, well, on that note then, Steve, we'll leave it there and look forward maybe to the day when we have a Chancellor Hall in the House of Commons. Let's see.
I think that would frighten the life out of them, but I would do my best, and I'm good at taking advice, Chris.
Yeah.
I'm good at, we have to learn stuff, and the stuff.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's what Tony Benn said. We never stop learning stuff.
Absolutely.
So thanks a lot, Steve, for that.
Thanks
Very
again.
interesting. Thank you very much indeed for watching. That's it for this edition of Resistance TV. This is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.